Okay, today we're going to read A Desperate Trek Across America. It starts on page 43 of volume 1 of your text. This is about a expedition of Spanish explorers into the New World. It takes place in Florida in 1528. So let's start halfway down the page 43. You may hear some dog sounds. I'm recording in a spare room of my house, and the dogs are at the door, and they're not happy that the door is closed. As their expedition falls apart, Spanish explorers struggle to survive in an unknown world. Florida Panhandle, fall 1528. The 250 starving Spanish adventurers dubbed the shallow estuary near their campsite the Bay of Horses, because every third day they killed yet another draft animal, roasted it, and consumed the flesh. 50 men had already died of disease, injury, and starvation. What was worse, after having walked the length of Florida without finding gold, those still alive had lost contact with their ships. They were stranded in an alien continent. We were in such straits that anything that had some semblance of a solution seemed good to us, wrote Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, the expedition's royal treasurer, in one of the most harrowing, page 44, survival stories ever told. I refrain here from telling this at greater length because each one can imagine for himself what could happen in a land so strange. Indeed, Cabeza de Vaca and the other leaders of the ill-fated venture had agreed to a desperate gamble, to trade their most effective weapons against the Indians, horses and firearms, for 5 makeshift vessels that might or might not be capable of carrying them to safety. Eating the horses gave them time to build the rafts. To make nails and saws, they threw their crossbows, along with stirrups and spurs, into an improvised forge. Like past conquistadors, Cabeza de Vaca and his men had relied on their breastplates, horses, and lethal weapons to keep the Indians at bay. Such overwhelming technological advantages meant they often did not bother to negotiate, instead simply imposing their will. By sacrificing the very tools of their supremacy, they would now have to face the New World fully exposed to its perils and hold on only by their wits. The expedition had unraveled with frightening speed. Just months earlier, the hopeful adventurers had embarked from Cuba in 4 ships and a brigantine and made landfall near present-day Tampa Bay, intending to take possession of Florida in the name of His Most Catholic Majesty. Caught up in the excitement and rush to explore, the commander rashly divided the expedition, ordering the captains to take their ships on an exploration of the coast, while the men and the horses were put ashore. They agreed to meet just a few miles north of the debarkation point, but the interminable and confusing coast of Florida prevented the 2 parties from making contact. With their jury-rigged saws, they cut down trees, dragged them to the beach, lashed them together with the tails and manes of their dead horses, and fashioned sails from their tattered shirts. After 5 or 6 weeks, they slaughtered their last horse, then dragged the 15-ton rafts into the water. 50 men crowded aboard each craft, the 5th commanded by Cabeza de Vaca. And so greatly can necessity prevail, he observed, that it made us risk going in this manner and placing ourselves in a sea so treacherous, and without any one of us who went having any knowledge of the art of navigation. The rafts floated only a few inches above the waterline. The waves would wash over the men as they traveled. Little did the men on the rafts know that they were embarking on an 8-year adventure that would ultimately take their few survivors across the entire continent. After several weeks, storms separated, page 45, the flotilla. Tormented by extreme hunger and drenched by the splashing of the waves, they were on the brink of death. The people began to faint in such a manner that when the sun set, Cabeza de Vaca would recall, all those who came in my raft were fallen on top of one another in it, so close to death that few were conscious. Only the helmsman and Cabeza de Vaca took turns steering the craft. 2 hours into the night, the helmsman told me that I should take charge of the raft, because he was in such a condition that he thought he would die that very night. Near dawn, Cabeza de Vaca heard the surf, and later that day they landed. While most of the men survived the harrowing month-long passage across the Gulf of Mexico, eventually washing up on the coast of what is now Texas, many more perished of exposure and hunger that winter, some even resorting to cannibalism. Fewer still withstood enslavement at the hands of the natives in the vicinity of Galveston Bay. Ultimately, only 4, Cabeza de Vaca, 2 other Spaniards in, page 46, commanding positions, and an African slave named Estebanico would escape their Indian masters after 6 years of toil. As slaves, Cabeza de Vaca and his companions were forced to cope with native North America on its own terms, bridging 2 worlds that had remained apart for 12,000 years or more. They lived by their wits, coming to terms with half a dozen native languages and making sense of societies that other Europeans could not even begin to fathom. Incredibly, the 4 castaways used this knowledge to refashion themselves into medicine men. As Cabeza de Vaca would explain it, we made the sign of the cross over them and blew on them and recited a Pater Noster and an Ave Maria, and then we prayed as best we could to God our Lord to give them health and inspire them to give us good treatment. In one instance, he revived a man who appeared to be dead. At the Indians' insistence, all 4 survivors performed curing ceremonies, and thus many natives came to believe that these 4 strange-looking beings were able to manipulate the power of nature. This real or imagined gifts of healing enabled the 4 survivors to move unimpeded, their reputation preceding them wherever they went. Nor were their actions a mere charade to win food and respect. They believed that their curative abilities went somehow much deeper. They came to see their incredible suffering odyssey as a test to which God had subjected them before revealing the true purpose of their existence. Page 47. They viewed their sufferings as mortifications of the flesh, their beatings and extreme hunger akin to those of flagellants, I think I'm saying that right, who inflicted torment upon themselves, or of monks who fasted nigh unto death. Paragraph 11. Once, alone and unable to find his party's camp, Cabeza de Vaca wandered into the woods naked, in dread of the approaching chill of night. But it pleased God that I found a tree of flame, and warmed by its fire I endured the cold that night. For 5 days he nursed that fire before finally finding his companions. The 4 wanderers were no longer mere castaways. They had become explorers once again. Yet theirs was a most peculiar expedition. 4 naked and unarmed outsiders were led by hundreds, even thousands of Indians. They were fed, protected, and passed off as though prized possessions from one indigenous group to the next. They became the first outsiders to behold what would become the American Southwest and northern Mexico, the first non-natives to describe this enormous land and its people. By the time the 4 re-emerged from the continental interior and reached the Pacific coast, they had been so utterly transformed by the experience that the fellow Europeans could hardly recognize them. Last page, page 48. A posse of Spanish slavers operating in what is now northwestern Mexico spotted potential prey. 13 Indians walking barefoot and clad in skins. On closer inspection, some of the details did not seem quite right. One was a black man. Could he be an Indian or an African emerging from the heart of the continent? Another member of the party appeared to be a haggard white man with hair hanging down to his waist and a beard reaching to his chest. When Cabeza de Vaca addressed them in perfect Spanish, the slavers were so astonished, he wrote, that's my dog, he's mad. He wrote that they neither talked to me nor managed to ask me anything, but bent themselves on rounding up the Indian escort. But Cabeza de Vaca and his companions would not allow it. No longer did the castaways view their companions as mere chattels, the rightful prize of Christian conquest. Paragraph 15. Perhaps no one understood their transformation more than the Indians themselves, who were unable to believe that Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 companions belonged to the same race as the slavers. The Indians had observed, he later wrote, that we cured the sick, and they, the Spanish slavers, killed those who were well, that we came naked and barefoot, and they went about dressed and on horses and with lances. and that we did not covet anything, but rather everything they gave us we later returned, and remained with nothing, and that the others had no other objective but to steal everything they found, and did not give anything to anyone. Cabeza de Vaca went back to Spain, attached himself to the court of Charles V, and was able to present his ideas of a humane colonization of the New World. After years of lobbying, he was dispatched to South America, where he attempted to carry out his plans, alas, with little success. He spent the last years of his life in his native Andalusia, reminiscing about his adventures in another world.